Chapter 1. The Clock That Struck Twice. It is a curious matter, in the long catalogue of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes's cases, that the most confounding of them, those which strained the limits of logic, often began with events that appeared merely eccentric or faintly amusing. The case I now set down, however, began with a letter which I can describe only as unnerving in the extreme. It arrived quite unexpectedly on a chill October morning in the year 1891, and it bore neither a return address nor signature. Holmes and I had just finished breakfast at Baker Street when Mrs. Hudson, our redoubtable landlady, entered bearing a single envelope of thick cream paper. "No name, sir," she said. "It was slid beneath the door not 5 minutes past." Holmes, lounging in his dressing gown, and already immersed in the agony columns of 3 morning papers, took the letter. Without glancing up, he held it to the light, sniffed it, and finally slit it open with a silver knife. His brow furrowed, then rose. He handed the note to me wordlessly. It read, "Mr. Holmes, I am writing to you. Though I know that by the time this reaches your hands, I shall already have been murdered. Do not look for the killer in my past, but in the future, my future, which I alone remember, and which none but I believe. Come to 19, Pevensey Place, before the stroke of 10. Bring your friend. The man who kills me is already in the room. Yours. In haste, see." I looked up at Holmes, stunned. "Well?" I asked. Holmes was already on his feet. "Pevensey Place is but 10 minutes' walk, and it is now 9:30. Come, Watson, there is no time to spare." "But surely this is a joke, a prank. The phrasing, 'Look not in my past, but in my future,' it's absurd." "Precisely," Holmes said, jamming his arms into his coat. "It is so absurd that it must be taken seriously. No man warns of his own murder in such terms unless he is either deranged or disturbingly correct." The house at 19 Pevensey Place was a tall Georgian townhouse of respectable design and modest upkeep. The morning mist hung low about its eaves, and the windows were shuttered despite the rising sun. Holmes rapped sharply at the door. No reply. Tried the handle. It opened. Inside, all was silent. We stepped into a dim foyer, the air heavy with the scent of dust and faintly of lilac. It was Holmes who spotted it first. A line of muddy footprints leading down the corridor to a door at the rear of the house. The front door had not been bolted. The trail of footprints had neither entry nor exit. We followed them. The rear room was a study of modest size, warmly furnished with dark wood and shelves of well-worn books. A clock on the mantel ticked steadily. Man lay in the armchair by the hearth, motionless. He was dressed in a grey wool coat, a silk scarf about his throat, and gloves on both hands. His eyes were open but unseeing. Holmes approached swiftly and placed 2 fingers to the man's neck. "Dead," he said quietly. "Within the last 10 minutes, I stepped forward. Could this be R.C.?" Holmes indicated the envelope, in the man's pocket, identical to the one we had received, but still sealed. He opened it. "Mr. Holmes, you are too late, but you already knew that. The man who kills me is clever, perhaps cleverer than you. He will smile when you question him. He may offer to help, but he is the only one who knew I would be here today. Ask him how he knew. Ceci." Davenport Holmes's face had gone unreadable. "I know this man," he said softly. "Colin Davenport, a minor poet, frequented the Diogenes Club briefly, left suddenly 2 years ago under strange circumstances." He turned to me. "Watson, note the time." I checked my pocket watch. Exactly 10 o'clock. At that precise instant, the clock on the mantel struck once, then again, then stopped. Holmes frowned. The clock struck twice at 10. Curious. Perhaps it's defective. No, it was wound recently. It is not error. It is message. He turned back to the body, kneeling now to examine the gloves. Then he looked to the window. "Note the condensation," he murmured. "One pane recently wiped. Our murderer watched to ensure the time. Yet no footprints in the mud outside. No forced lock." He stood. "Watson, we are standing not merely at the scene of a murder, but at the edge of something stranger. A man who predicted his own death, claimed foreknowledge of the future, and died in a locked house at the moment he said he would." "You think the killer was already here, I think," Holmes said grimly. "That the killer never left." And so began the mystery of the man who remembered his future, who wrote his own death into motion, and whose killer, as Holmes would later prove, was both entirely ordinary and completely impossible. Chapter 2. The Ink and the Impossible. It was just before noon when we returned to Baker Street, still shaken by the events at Pevensey Place. The constables had arrived, summoned by Holmes through a hastily dispatched messenger, and Inspector Lestrade had been notified, though Holmes made it plain that we would be handling the matter independently, until further notice. As Holmes flung off his overcoat and dropped into his armchair, I could not help but stare at him. He appeared neither rattled nor triumphant, only intensely focused, like a predator caught mid-thought. "Well, Holmes," I said at last, settling into the chair opposite, "this is unlike anything we've encountered." He nodded slowly. "Indeed, a murder predicted, a time fixed, and a killer unaccounted for. The whole affair smacks of theatre, but the body is quite real." I leaned forward. "Do you believe Davenport truly foresaw his own death?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "You are asking whether I believe in prophecy." "Or time travel," I said, though the words felt absurd even as I spoke them. "Watson," Holmes said patiently, "you know me better than that. I do not subscribe to metaphysical explanations until every rational one is exhausted, but it does not follow that the matter is simple. The more improbable the crime, the more cunning its design." He rose, crossed to the mantel, and selected a pipe from his rack. As he packed it, he gestured towards the newspaper folded on the table. "Before we return to Davenport, indulge me in a small demonstration." I raised an eyebrow. Holmes passed me the morning edition of the Times. "The announcement section, third column from the right, halfway down. Tell me what you make of it." I scanned the section. "There's a notice of a wedding. Miss Abigail, Hartley to Mr. Reuben Quayle, tomorrow at St. Jude's." "Precisely. And what else?" I squinted. "Not much. Rather ordinary." "Ah," Holmes said, puffing his pipe, "but what you missed is that Mr. Reuben Quayle is a known con artist, wanted in Sussex under the name Quayle, but in Kent under the alias Reuben Smith." I sat up. "You're certain?" "I am. The description matches exactly. and the address is the same as one given in an anonymous tip received by Scotland Yard last week. But the name in the notice, how could it be printed without suspicion? Holmes smiled. Because the truth is often safest in the open, where no one bothers to look closely. Now, if a man can get away with marrying under a false name, imagine what else can be disguised, like a murder, hidden beneath the illusion of inevitability. He let the words hang in the air, then turned back to the case. Now, Watson, let us consider the facts. I drew my notebook from my coat. Firstly, Holmes began, pacing, we receive a letter, unsigned save for the initial C, which claims the sender will be murdered at precisely 10 o'clock. He urges us to visit Pevensey Place, where we find him, dead, exactly as foretold. Colin Davenport, I confirmed. Correct. A minor poet, previously of the Diogenes Club. Mysterious disappearance 2 years ago. And now murdered under surreal circumstances. He wrote a second letter, I said, flipping through my notes, addressed to us, but left in his own pocket. Holmes nodded. Yes, that detail interests me greatly. Why write to us twice? Once sent, and once left behind? Perhaps he wished to confirm his identity after death. Perhaps, Holmes murmured, but more likely he feared interference. The second letter, Watson, was for us alone. It accused someone specific, though it did so obliquely. Ask him how he knew, I quoted. Just so, meaning someone knew in advance where Davenport would be and when, and yet was not the sender of either letter. Holmes crossed to the desk, where he retrieved both notes. Now, observe. Same paper, same ink, same hand, and yet, look here. He handed me both letters. I examined them side by side. The ink here, I said, indicating the second note, is slightly smudged. Holmes nodded. And the other? Clean? Crisp. Precisely. The posted letter was written with care. The one left in his pocket was written in haste, perhaps even moments before his death. A man resigned to his end, still trying to leave a trail. Holmes turned to the fire, his voice softer now. There is a desperation in that letter, Watson. A final plea, and if we ignore it, we allow the killer to walk free beneath the veil of fantasy. You believe the murder was planned to appear supernatural. I believe it was designed to confuse, to repel scrutiny. If you tell men a murder is inevitable, was foretold, few will ask how it was done. Holmes drew a deep breath, but we must ask. Later that afternoon, a telegram arrived. It was from Inspector Lestrade. Body confirmed as Colin Davenport. No signs of forced entry. No witnesses. Clock on premises still under analysis. Will send full report by nightfall. Holmes read it, then handed it to me. No witnesses, I said. No signs of struggle. Just a corpse, a clock, and a locked door, Holmes mused. And a dead man who spoke of remembering his future. Turned his gaze out the window. Outside, the fog had thickened once more, dulling the outlines of the city into shifting shadows. He said, almost to himself, the question is no longer how Colin Davenport died. He looked at me then, sharply. It is how he knew when he would. Chapter 3. The First Clues, a Scene of Deception. It was just past 4 o'clock when Holmes and I once more, stood within the sombre confines of Pevensey Place. The rain had thinned to a cold drizzle, giving the tall Georgian house a grey, almost spectral air. Inside, the air remained close, heavy with the scent of dust, coal smoke, and something subtler, something faintly metallic. Holmes moved with his usual intensity, every step measured. He paused in the front hall, his sharp eyes flicking over the worn rug, the umbrella stand, and the brass knob of the inner door. "Note the absence of watermarks," he said. "It rained this morning. Davenport must have arrived early enough to avoid the downpour, or someone wiped the floor afterward." I glanced down. The rug was clean, surprisingly so. "You believe the scene may have been altered?" "I believe it was curated." We stepped again into the study where Davenport's body had been found, now removed, though the chair remained in the same place by the fire. The hearth was cold. The carpet bore the faint impression of the poet's boot heels, and the clock on the mantel ticked on, its face reading 4:10. Holmes moved to it immediately. "You recall," he said, "it struck twice at the hour." "Yes," I replied. 10 o'clock, 2 chimes. Holmes opened the back panel, waited. Hammer mechanism, no sign of defect. Yet the bell is set to chime only once per hour. For it to strike twice! He trailed off, then glanced to me. It was tampered with. To mark the moment more dramatically, more likely to fix it. If you wish to deceive someone into believing an event occurred at a specific moment, Watson, what better method than to orchestrate a sound, precise and unmistakable? That second chime was not an accident. It was punctuation. He stepped back and examined the mantel. "Do you observe anything else unusual?" I looked closely. The clock sat slightly askew. Beside it, a brass candlestick, unlit. A small porcelain vase, nothing obvious. Holmes reached forward and lifted the vase, revealing a tiny indentation beneath. "Dust ring. The vase has been moved recently." He sniffed the rim of the candlestick next. "Lamp oil," he murmured, "but no soot. The candle was never lit. The wick is new." He turned back toward the desk in the corner. "This room is a stage," he said. "A stage set for a performance. One in which the actor knew his part only in the final act." Nehin, the writing desk, Holmes examined the drawers. Most were filled with ordinary effects. Stationery, receipts, small tins of sealing wax. But one drawer stuck part way through. He jimmied it open with a penknife and retrieved a torn scrap of paper, crumpled and stained. He flattened it against the blotter and read aloud. "Wrong about the clock. He told me it must be exact. 10. Always 10. But what if he—" Holmes frowned. "The hand is different," I said, peering over his shoulder. "Yes, not Davenport's." He turned it over. No signature. "Who is he?" "That," Holmes said, "is the question. Whoever it was, he was very particular about time." He moved to the chair by the hearth, where the body had rested. "This is where Davenport sat," he said, "presumably of his own accord. He dressed for the occasion. His gloves were on, his coat buttoned." "Odd that," I said. "He didn't remove his coat despite being indoors." "Exactly." Holmes crouched by the leg of the chair. "And see here, Watson. Do you notice this?" There was a faint scrape along the floorboards, a pale streak. Holmes withdrew a small magnifying lens and studied the groove. moved recently," he murmured. "The chair was slid back into place after the body had fallen, or was moved there. Either way, someone wished to conceal the disruption." He stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "I submit that Davenport did not die in that chair. Or if he did, he was placed there immediately after. The crime was staged down to the position of the corpse. You believe someone was in the house with him?" "I believe someone never left." We next examined the back hallway, the same corridor down which we had followed the footprints that morning. They were still faintly visible, a narrow, straight path. Holmes crouched. "Watson, do you see anything unusual about these?" I peered closer. "They're straight, no overlap, very deliberate, indeed. But there's no return path, which suggests the man who made them either never left," he stood, eyes scanning the walls, "or found another exit." He moved to a panel near the rear door and tapped twice. A hollow sound. With a grunt, he pressed at the panel's edge. It swung open with a soft creak, revealing a narrow passage, dusty, cobwebbed and lined with shelves. "A servant's corridor," Holmes said. "Not on the main floor plans, possibly used in the past for discreet movement. And large enough to fit a man." He nodded. "This is how the killer came and went. Or waited. Unseen. Unheard." As we returned to the study, Holmes's mood grew darker. "The more I learn," he said, "the more this case resists simple classification. A man predicts his own death. A killer manipulates time, architecture, and perception, and all of it executed with almost surgical precision. He looked out the window, where the fog was returning with the dusk. There is a mind behind this, Watson, one not content with murder alone, but with spectacle, a crime designed to appear impossible." He turned back toward me, his expression grave. "And yet every illusion has its seams. We have only to find them." Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. If there is one trait Holmes possessed to a degree unmatched by any man I have known, it was his instinct for assembling the human, puzzle before the evidence had fully declared itself. He understood, even before motive or method had been made plain, that murder seldom occurs in a vacuum. It is born of frictions, some buried for years, others sparked in a moment. So it was that by the next morning we found ourselves in a small study room at Scotland Yard, seated opposite Inspector Lestrade, who had been reluctantly looped into the affair. "Very odd business," Lestrade muttered, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I'd have called it suicide if not for your insistence, Holmes. No forced entry, no signs of struggle. Locked from the inside, wasn't it? Davenport could have locked it himself," Holmes replied. "Or someone could have locked it after. What interests me more is why the room was staged. Why strike the clock twice? Why call for witnesses to an already decided death?" Lestrade shook his head. "You've got 3 names, I gather." Holmes tapped his fingers together. 3 for now. All were known to Davenport at one time or another. All had reasons, subtle or otherwise, to resent him. And all had the means, if not the opportunity. He retrieved a small list from his coat pocket. "Let us begin, Watson, with Miss Eliza Kemp." Miss Kemp arrived promptly at 11. She was a woman of striking poise, perhaps 45, with greying hair coiled tight beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and gloves so Immaculate they might have been polished. There was something hardened in her mouth, something quietly scornful about the angle of her jaw. "I hadn't seen Mr. Davenport in over a year," she said coolly when seated. "And no, I wasn't surprised to hear he was dead." Holmes raised a brow. "That is unusually candid. He was a manipulator," she said simply. "Brilliant, but cruel. He fancied himself a prophet of some kind. When he left London, he was in the midst of what he called his temporal experiment." "What did that entail?" Eliza gave a bitter smile. "He claimed to have seen the future. He said he knew things before they happened. He wrote poems with dates, some years in advance. He would change topics mid-conversation, because he said he'd already had the conversation in his head the day before. Watson and I exchanged glances. And what was your relationship to him, Miss Kemp?" "We were once engaged," she said flatly. "Briefly." "Why did you part?" "I discovered," she said, "that I was not the only woman he believed, fated to love him. He told me I would regret leaving him, that he'd seen it all. And did you regret it?" "Only," she said, rising, "that I didn't do it sooner." Our second visitor was a younger man, thin, nervous and bookish, with round spectacles that kept slipping down his nose. His name was Oliver Finch, and he introduced himself as a former student of Davenport's. "I studied under him for a term at King's College," he said, fiddling with his collar. "But he left before the year was done. Said academia was out of step with his ideas." "What sort of ideas?" Finch flushed. "He believed memory worked both directions, that the mind might recall the future, the way it recalls the past, under the right circumstances." "Did he ever succeed in proving this?" Finch hesitated. "He believed he had. He once told me the date my father would die, and he was correct. Down to the day." I leaned forward. "And how did he explain it?" "He said he'd remembered it from a future he hadn't lived yet." Holmes's voice remained flat. "Did you resent him?" "No," Finch said quickly. "He was brilliant, but strange. He thought time was not a river, but a circle." "Where were you yesterday morning at 10 o'clock?" Finch blinked. "In the reading room at the British Library." I've told the inspector already." "There are records." Holmes nodded. "One more thing, Mr. Finch. Did Mr. Davenport ever speak of someone watching him?" Finch paused, lips twitching. "He believed someone was tracking him. Not a real person, but someone from the future. Someone who would stop him if he proved too much." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And did he name this shadow?" "Yes," Finch said. "He called him the man who repeats." The final visitor was unlike the others in every way, charming, self-possessed, and quick with a smile. Mr. Lionel Marsh, a theatrical producer, greeted us as though we were old friends reunited. "Davenport?" he said, shaking his head sadly. Now, there was a man born in the wrong era. "You knew him well?" Holmes asked. "We met 2 years ago. He came to me with a collection of monologues, said he wanted to stage a play called The Future Remembers. Eccentric but clever, a real visionary." "Did you produce it?" Marsh laughed. "No. Too strange for the West End, too bleak. The protagonist dies in the first act and spends the rest of the show predicting his own death." Holmes leaned forward. "And did you remain in contact?" Marsh hesitated. "On and off. He grew more erratic. Last time I saw him, he told me the date of my next illness. Said I'd catch a fever on the 18th. I laughed. Did you? Marsh's smile faded slightly. I did. Holmes's tone sharpened. And yesterday morning, at my club, the Athenaeum, I signed in. Did Mr. Davenport ever threaten you? No, Marsh said, but he warned me. Said my name was in the margin of his last page. We exchanged looks. Last page? I asked. He claimed to be writing the final entry of his life, a kind of death diary. Holmes's eyes gleamed. And did he say where this document might be found? He said it would be underneath the clock. After the last of them had departed, Holmes turned to me with that familiar glint in his eye, the one that always preceded revelation. Well? I asked. He tapped his temple. They all had reason. Kemp for betrayal, Finch for fear, Marsh for notoriety. And yet none of them are what they seem. You believe one of them did it. I believe, Holmes said, that one of them thinks they did. I stared. Thinks? Holmes folded his arms. This is no ordinary crime, Watson. This is a narrative, a constructed timeline. Someone rewrote the future by controlling the past. The answer lies not in what these people said, but in what Davenport wrote last. He glanced toward the door, and I intend to find it, beneath the clock. Chapter 5. A Convenient Truth. It was precisely 24 hours after the death of Colin Davenport that Scotland Yard made its first official move. Inspector Lestrade, appearing more self-satisfied than usual, arrived at Baker Street with a dispatch folder tucked under one arm and a smug gleam in his eye. "Well, Holmes," he said as he entered, "I believe we've spared you the trouble. The case may be stranger than most, but I don't think we need any of your metaphysical nonsense to wrap it up." Holmes didn't look up from his violin. He plucked once, adjusted a peg, and finally said, "Go on, Lestrade. Amaze me." Lestrade laid the folder down and flipped it open. "We found this at Davenport's lodgings. Letters from one Oliver Finch. Dozens of them, some dated weeks ago, others more recent. Obsessive tone. Mentions of voices, dreams, fate, and repeated warnings. It's clear he believed Davenport was hiding something from him. Some new discovery. Possibly something he feared would be stolen." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And your conclusion?" Lestrade gave a satisfied nod. "The man's clearly unstable. We questioned him again this morning. Cornered, he stammered through his answers, tried to backtrack on everything. Couldn't even recall where he was at 9:30 the day of the murder." "Curious," Holmes murmured. "Curious?" Lestrade repeated. "You're not seriously suggesting he didn't do it?" Holmes laid his violin aside and leaned forward. "On the contrary, I'm suggesting the very certainty of your conclusion troubles me." Lestrade frowned. Holmes continued. "Finch is an anxious man, easily flustered, with little capacity for deception. If he had killed Davenport, why write scores of letters hinting at his obsession? Why create a paper trail when silence would serve him better? He's mad," Lestrade said simply, "and madmen don't behave rationally." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Precisely. But this crime was entirely rational. Over-engineered, in fact. The clock, the positioning, the double letter. Watson, do you recall what Finch said Davenport called his supposed adversary?" I nodded. "The man who repeats." Holmes looked back to Lestrade. This was a staged performance, Inspector. A closed-room mystery constructed to distract the observer. And now, the audience, yourself included, has found its villain in the only man visibly nervous enough to look guilty. Lestrade's eyes narrowed. Do you have a better candidate? Holmes smiled faintly. I suspect I will soon. That afternoon, Holmes and I returned to Pevensey Place. The constable, posted at the door, gave a stiff nod and unlocked it without comment. Inside, the house had grown colder. The study where Davenport died retained the scent of stale ink and cold ashes. Holmes went straight to the fireplace. He moved the clock aside with reverence, then examined the marble ledge beneath. Davenport told Marsh his last page would be here, beneath the clock. I crouched beside him. But there's no drawer. No, Holmes said, tapping the stone. But there is a seam. With a pocket knife, he loosened a narrow edge in the base of the mantel. Something shifted. A panel slid free with a whispering scrape. Inside was a single folded sheet of parchment. Holmes unfolded it carefully. The paper was thick, the ink faded but legible. Across the top, in a flowing hand, was written, Entry 72. The hour approaches. Below. Lines followed, half prose, half verse. They do not see the circle I walk, though I leave footprints behind me. They cannot hear the ticking lie, though it chimes for them only. The man who repeats is already here. He knocks before I know it. Holmes read it aloud in a low voice, then paused. There's something else. He turned the paper over, scribbled hastily in the margin, almost as an afterthought, was a name. Marsh. Surely that clinches it, I said, as we returned to Baker Street. Holmes did not reply at once. He sat down at the table and laid the page beside him, staring at it for a long while. It's too perfect, he murmured. Too clear. You suspect the paper was planted? No, he said slowly. I believe Davenport wrote it. But why write it this way? Why name Marsh not in the body, but as a footnote? I frowned. A dying man might scrawl the truth wherever he can. Or he might be led to it, rose suddenly. Watson, prepare your coat. We're going to visit Mr. Marsh. Lionel Marsh received us at his flat in Chelsea, a well-appointed bachelor's residence with Persian carpets, exotic bookends, and a grand pianola in the corner. He greeted us with his usual affable charm. Back again, he said, pouring tea. Have you found my name on a prophecy yet? Holmes accepted the cup, but did not drink. We've found your name on something far more material, Mr. Marsh. A final journal entry, hidden beneath the clock. Marsh's smile faltered for the briefest moment. You don't say. I do. Marsh sat slowly. And what did it say, this final confession? Holmes did not answer immediately. He sat down the teacup and leaned forward. Tell me, Mr. Marsh, where were you truly between 9 and 10 o'clock yesterday morning? I already told Lestrade at my club. Yes, Holmes said softly. But the club steward now admits he didn't see you arrive until nearly 10. You signed in late. Marsh's jaw tightened. You think I killed him? I think. You knew he would die, Holmes said, and I think you knew how it would happen. Marsh stood. This is absurd. Is it? Holmes said, now rising as well. You staged plays. You understood timing, blocking, audience reaction. Who better to orchestrate a death with dramatic precision? I had no reason. You had every reason. Davenport's story was too fantastical for the world. But if you published it as a producer, posthumously, his words, his final play, it would be genius. And you, the benefactor, the curator of a prophet's truth. Marsh paled. Holmes went on, quieter now. You didn't kill him, Mr. Marsh. You merely made it possible. You gave him the stage, and he wrote the ending. Back at Baker Street, Holmes fell silent once more. He staged his own death, I said at last, or believed he did, Holmes replied. But someone helped him prepare the performance. Marsh lit the lamps and set the scene. And the murder? Still unproven, Holmes murmured, but too perfect to be natural. He stood and stared into the darkening street. I'm missing something, he said. One false note in the melody. One tick out of time. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A Hidden Inconsistency. That night, Holmes did not sleep. From my room above, I heard the slow creak of the floorboards, the quiet clink of his chemical set, and the intermittent scrape of chalk on slate as he scribbled, diagrams I would not understand until the case had fully unravelled. By the time I joined him in the sitting room the following morning, the fireplace was glowing with embers, and the scent of coffee had replaced the sharper tang of pipe smoke. Holmes stood with his back to the hearth, his eyes on the window. You're unusually quiet this morning, I said, pouring myself a cup. He didn't answer at first. Then, as if he had been debating whether to speak at all, he turned to me with a curious expression. Watson, he said, what time did we arrive at Pevensey Place on the morning of the murder? A few minutes before 10. And the clock struck twice at 10 precisely. Once, and then again. Yes, we both noted it. Holmes nodded slowly. And did anything strike you as peculiar about the clock? I frowned. Only that it chimed twice for the hour. He moved across the room and withdrew a folded sheet from his notebook. On it, he had sketched the layout of Davenport's study. The hearth, the desk, the window, the chair by the fire, the clock on the mantel. Then, in the margin he had written, clock face faced inward. Inward? I repeated. Holmes tapped the sketch. Toward the room, not toward the street, meaning the chime was meant for us. The sound, not the time, was the signal. I stared at him. A signal to what? To establish the hour, Watson, but falsely. He began pacing. If the clock was altered to chime twice, and its hands adjusted to 10 precisely, then it becomes a prop, not a timepiece. A fixed point of reference, placed deliberately. Are you saying the murder occurred before we arrived? Holmes stopped mid-stride. His eyes gleamed. Precisely. I set my cup down, my heart quickening. But he was still warm. His skin hadn't gone cold. Because the room was stifling. The fire had been lit and allowed to die down before we arrived. Someone wanted to preserve the illusion of recent death. Body temperature can be misleading in an enclosed, overheated space. I sat back, stunned. Then the letter was timed not to warn us of the crime, but to distract us from when it really occurred. Holmes smiled faintly. A stage must have its curtain. We returned to Pevensey Place once more. this time with no formal purpose and no one to impede us. The property had been turned over to the solicitors, and Holmes had obtained temporary leave to inspect the study alone. The room, chilled and silent now, seemed even smaller than I recalled. The chair by the hearth had been moved again, the clock wound anew by some dutiful constable. The illusion had been reset, but not perfectly. Holmes crouched near the grate. "See this, Watson?" I bent to look. He pointed at the underside of the mantel, faint scorch marks along the edge. The fire was relit in haste, possibly with paraffin, and not just for heat, but to accelerate decomposition, trick the senses. He stood and crossed to the desk. "What's more," he said, lifting a ledger, "we were meant to find the room exactly as it was, but there's always one thing they can't control." He held up the ledger's corner. Dust. I stepped closer. Beneath the leather-bound edge was a perfect rectangle of lighter wood. "This ledger was moved after the dust settled," he said, "placed back, but imperfectly. And who would have touched it? Someone searching," Holmes murmured. "Or hiding." He flipped through the pages. Nothing. Then, as he neared the back, something caught his attention. "Watson, look, here." Inserted between the last two pages was a folded receipt. "To Mr. C. Davenport. Item, custom-built mantel clock. Description, double chime mechanism, modified strike. Requested, 2 bells at 10, silent otherwise. Delivered, 2 October." Holmes stared at the receipt in silence. "The clock was built for this moment," he said. "Not altered after. It was designed." "A murder constructed weeks in advance," I said. "Indeed, a murder performed on a schedule only the victim and killer knew." He turned to me with narrowed eyes. "And yet, Watson, there is something more troubling still. What is it?" Holmes tapped the receipt. "This order was placed in late September, but our victim vanished from public life 2 years ago. No records, no sightings, nothing." "Then how—" Holmes met my gaze. "The receipt bears no signature. It was not ordered by Davenport." Back at Baker Street, Holmes paced furiously. He would not speak for nearly an hour, and I dared not interrupt him. Only when the street lamps outside had begun to flicker into life did he finally halt. "There's something we have missed, Watson." He sat heavily. "The letters, the timing, the suspects, they all orbit around Davenport, but none of them explain why he allowed it." I furrowed my brow. "Allowed what?" "His own death." Holmes leaned forward, voice low. "I believe he knew he would die, yes, but I also believe he was promised something. Some final brilliance, some lasting legacy, something worth more to him than survival. And someone offered it to him? Or made him believe he had already accepted. He stood suddenly. And that is the inconsistency. Not in the letters, not in the clock, but in the psychology. I stared at him. You think someone convinced him he had no choice?" Holmes nodded grimly. "And I intend to find out who." Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. When the second body was discovered, it arrived not as a conclusion, but as a question that undermined everything we thought we understood about the death of Colin Davenport. It was the morning after Holmes had uncovered the receipt for the custom-built clock. I had just returned from a brisk constitutional in Hyde Park, When Mrs. Hudson met me on the stairs, her face unusually pale. "There's someone downstairs," she said. "A constable from Lambeth. Says he needs to speak to Mr. Holmes immediately." I stepped into our sitting room to find Holmes already there, fully dressed, his coat draped over his arm, speaking briskly to a uniformed officer I did not recognize. "The name again," Holmes was saying. "George Lavery, sir," replied the constable. "Found in a rented room off Lee Street. Lodgings under a false name. Neighbours said he came and went at odd hours, mostly kept to himself." "And the condition of the body?" "Same as the poet's," said Lavery. "Laid out in a chair, gloves on, note in his coat pocket." I froze. "Another note?" Holmes nodded without looking at me. "A second performance. Come, Watson. The play is not yet done." The lodging-house at 28 Lee Street was a grim little building tucked behind a warehouse. The windows were caked with soot, and the interior smelled of boiled meat and paraffin. A dour landlady led us up a narrow staircase to the top floor. "He called himself Henry Ainsley," she muttered, but the name didn't suit him. Bit of a fidgeter, always scribbling in a notebook. Holmes nodded politely and stepped into the room. It was small and sparsely furnished. Bed, chair, small desk, but it was the figure in the chair that drew all attention. A man in his 30s, lean and sharp-featured, sat slumped, head tilted slightly to the left. A scarf lay neatly draped across his lap. He wore gloves. Holmes crouched immediately and examined the hands. No signs of struggle, no bruising. The same careful dressing as Davenport. He reached into the man's coat pocket and retrieved the envelope. There was a single page inside. "This is not a death. It is an echo. The man you seek will kill again, because he has already done so." See, Holmes stood slowly, turning the page over, then held it to the light. "It's the same stationery," he said. "Same watermark, same ink. But this—" He tapped the page. "This is not Davenport's hand." "Then who?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he crossed to the desk and began rifling through the drawers. He withdrew a notebook, cracked it open, and flipped rapidly through the pages. He stopped at a line near the back and read aloud. "Colin is not afraid any more. He has seen the circle from the outside. I am only the echo. He is the centre." Below that, one word had been written and circled. Proof. Holmes closed the notebook. "I know this man," he murmured. "George Lavery, former student of metaphysics, obsessed with non-linear causality. He wrote to Davenport 3 times last year, all unanswered. And he, what? Killed himself in imitation?" Holmes looked up sharply. "No, he was killed in imitation. There is a difference." He turned to the constable. "Tell Lestrade this is no copycat. This is escalation." We returned to Baker Street in silence. Holmes was subdued, introspective in a way I had come to associate with a mind straining against the edge of a greater truth. "You believe both men were murdered?" I asked. "I do. And yet both wrote letters, sat willingly in those chairs, dressed the part." "Yes," Holmes said darkly, "because someone told them to." He began pacing. Davenport believed in a circle, time without beginning or end. Lavery believed in proof. They were willing. They thought they were participating in a revelation. And instead, they were being eliminated. Used, Holmes snapped, like actors in a performance whose script they did not write. He turned to me, eyes burning. "Watson, what is the one thing that links both men?" They were both obsessed with the future. Holmes shook his head. No. They were both convinced that someone else had already seen it. That evening, Holmes's behavior turned increasingly erratic. He snapped at Mrs. Hudson, refused tea, and lit no fewer than 5 cigarettes within the hour. He scribbled lines on envelopes, tore up entire pages of his notes, and stared at the clock on the mantelpiece with a fixed intensity that unnerved even me. Finally, just past 10, he stood abruptly and said, "I'm going to Marsh's flat." "Now?" "I won't be long. Stay here." "But Holmes—" He was already halfway out the door. I sat alone for nearly an hour, staring into the fireplace and listening for the sound of boots on the stair. When the door finally creaked open, Holmes returned, not out of breath but clearly altered. His complexion was pale, his expression unreadable. "What did you find?" He didn't answer. He walked across the room and sat heavily in his chair, hands steepled, gaze unfocused. I waited. Finally, he spoke. I asked Marsh to tell me what he really knew about Davenport. And he told me that Davenport predicted his own death 3 weeks ago, down to the exact time, said it would be part of a message. A message for whom? "For us," Holmes said. He looked up at me. "For the man who would follow the circle to its centre. The one who could break it." I leaned forward. "Holmes, are you telling me Davenport orchestrated his own death so that you would find the person behind it?" Holmes said nothing. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew something wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it. A silver pocket watch. It was cracked, its hands frozen. At 10 o'clock exactly. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The next morning dawned with a deceptive calm. The clouds that had brooded over London for days had finally dispersed, leaving a washed blue sky and air so crisp it seemed to sharpen sound. It was the sort of morning that suggested renewal. Yet, in the sitting room of 221B Baker Street, the atmosphere remained curiously heavy. Holmes had risen before me and already set the wheels of a plan in motion. "I've invited our remaining 3 suspects for a gathering this afternoon," he said, scribbling on notepaper and dispatching messages through a young street runner. "Miss Kemp, Mr. Marsh, and Mr. Finch. Together here at 4. "All 3, I asked, surprised. "Won't that make them wary?" "Precisely," Holmes said. "If the spider senses the web trembling, it will either retreat or strike." I narrowed my eyes. "You believe one of them orchestrated both deaths?" "I believe," Holmes replied, "that one of them believes he or she is above suspicion. That is the key to unravelling this illusion." He leaned forward. "Watson, when someone manipulates time, not just the clocks, but the sequence of our understanding, then we must stop looking at who was where and begin asking who benefits from the confusion." I opened my mouth to ask more, but Holmes had already stood and was donning his coat. "I shall return shortly. In the meantime, prepare 3 cups of tea." 3. 1 for each of them," he said, pausing at the door. "But don't label them. Leave it to chance." At exactly 4 o'clock, the bell rang 3 times in short succession. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson ushered in our 3 guests, each dressed in shades of unease. Eliza Kemp arrived first, her expression unreadable behind her veil. She did not remove her gloves till Lionel Marsh followed, charming as ever, but his usual confidence carried a strained edge. Oliver Finch came last, shoulders hunched, glasses slightly askew, his hair in visible disarray. Holmes greeted each with his most neutral politeness, offering tea without ceremony. "There's a matter I wish to raise with all of you," he said, motioning to the chairs around the hearth. "It concerns the matter of Colin Davenport, and the question of who knew." Miss Kemp took a seat without comment. Marsh accepted the middle chair, legs crossed, eyes darting occasionally toward Finch, who sat stiffly, as if unsure whether to drink his tea or flee the room. Holmes remained standing, his silhouette cast long against the drawn curtains. "You each had some link to Mr. Davenport," he began. "You knew of his obsessions, his delusions, some might say, and his predictions, and yet none of you have accounted for one particular detail." He turned to the mantel and picked up the silver pocket-watch we had found in Marsh's possession the night before. Its glass remained cracked, its hands frozen at 10. "This," Holmes said softly, "is not Davenport's. It belonged to Lavery." 3 pairs of eyes shifted. He carried it with him always, and it was found in his coat pocket, shattered but unmistakable. And inside the casing I discovered a note, folded thin, almost hidden. He held it aloft, written in Davenport's hand. There was a shift in the room, small but perceptible. Holmes did not unfold the paper. Instead, he returned it to the pocket-watch and placed it in the centre of the tea-table between the guests. "Curious," he said, "how men create myths of their own deaths. But more curious still, how others carry them out." He stepped back. "Miss Kemp, Mr. Marsh, Mr. Finch, I want each of you to tell me, in your own words, why Colin Davenport died." There was a silence. Miss Kemp was the first to speak. "He was mad," she said evenly. "He believed he could remember the future. He was bound to do something dangerous eventually. I always feared it would be himself." Finch spoke next, nervously twisting his fingers. He was searching for something. Proof. He thought the key was in death, that it would unlock time. Holmes turned his gaze to Marsh, who had not yet spoken. "And you, Mr. Marsh?" Marsh's smile had returned, but it did not reach his eyes. "He was a performer," he said. "Always was. I think he chose a final curtain." Holmes nodded, as though satisfied. Then he asked quite suddenly, "And which of you drank the tea with the sugar cube?" Startled, they looked down at their cups. None could answer. "I thought not," Holmes said. He walked back to the mantel. "Only one cup was laced," he said softly, "with an agent designed to loosen the tongue, if not the conscience." At this, Marsh stood abruptly. "Is this some kind of trick?" Holmes turned, utterly calm. "Not at all. Just an experiment. And if your conscience is clear, then no harm done." Finch rose as well, knocking his teacup over in the process. Miss Kemp remained seated, lips pressed tight. Holmes offered no explanation, only gestured to the door. "You may go. I've heard what I needed." When they had left, I rounded on Holmes. "Surely you didn't poison them?" "Of course not," he said mildly. "Just valerian root, common, harmless. But they didn't know that." He sat down and steepled his fingers again. "You saw it, didn't you?" Marsh's reaction. "No. Miss Kemp's lack of one." I frowned. She didn't even look at her cup, Watson. Didn't glance at the spilled tea. Didn't twitch when I mentioned the laced sugar. "You think she knew it was a bluff?" "I think," Holmes said slowly, "she knew I wasn't lying, but also knew she hadn't drunk the affected cup. Because she switched it," Holmes said simply, "before I entered the room." I stared at him. "She's not just involved," Holmes said. "She's orchestrating, and she's watching for who notices." He held up the cracked watch once more. "Davenport didn't die for a belief. He died because someone made him believe." He leaned forward, eyes dark. "And now, Watson, the game begins in earnest." Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. London's grey veil returned the next morning. A blanket of damp mist that muted the cobblestones and turned every passing figure into a silhouette. Yet it did little to obscure the undercurrent of tension that hung in our sitting room at 221B, Baker Street. Holmes was unusually still, seated by the window with his hands tented before his face, his gaze not on the street but on some internal vision he had yet to share. The cracked pocket watch lay on the table beside him, open to reveal its lifeless hands forever frozen at 10. It was just past 9 when the knock came. A hurried rapping, urgent and uneven. Mrs. Hudson admitted Inspector Lestrade moments later, his hat still dripping and his brow lined with alarm. "Holmes," he said without ceremony, "there's been another incident." Holmes did not rise. "Who?" "Oliver Finch. He's missing." My pulse quickened. "Missing?" "Vanished from his boarding-house sometime after midnight," Lestrade said grimly. "His room was found in disarray. Papers everywhere. No sign of forced entry. The landlady says she heard voices, 2 of them, around 12:30. Then nothing." Holmes finally stood. "2 voices," he repeated, "and no struggle. None that we could see. But here's the part that'll concern you." Lestrade reached into his coat and handed over an envelope. This was left on his desk. Holmes took the letter, broke the seal, and read the single typed line aloud. "The echo is incomplete. The circle cannot close while the last voice remains. There was no signature, no name." Lestrade glanced between us. "This echo business, any idea what it means?" Holmes folded the paper with eerie care. "Yes," he said quietly. "It means that someone believes Finch was the final thread. And now they're trying to cut it. We arrived at Finch's boarding-house within the hour. The building was a narrow, aging structure near Paddington, hemmed in by cracked railings and soot-darkened brick. The landlady, a stout woman with anxious eyes, led us up the stairs. "I didn't think anything of the voices at first," she said. "Mr. Finch sometimes read aloud. But it was different last night. Calmer, like someone was persuading him." Holmes said nothing as we entered the small upstairs room. It was chaotic, but not violently so. Books had been pulled from shelves. A teacup lay shattered by the fireplace. The desk drawer hung open, its contents scattered. What was he working on? Holmes asked, scanning the room. The landlady shrugged. Always scribbling things, poems, letters, sometimes to himself, I think. Holmes moved to the desk, among. The papers. He plucked out a page and held it to the light. I dreamed I had already died. I dreamed I had told the truth, and it was too late. He said the end was a kindness. I almost believed him. A faint tremor passed over Holmes's face, gone in an instant. Finch was afraid, I said quietly. No, Holmes replied. He was resigned. Back at Baker Street, Holmes laid out the evidence on the table in a deliberate circle. The 2 pocket watches, the final letters of both Davenport and Lavery, the page from Finch's desk, the receipt for the custom clock. 3 men, he said, each convinced of a future they had not yet lived, each persuaded quietly, masterfully, that death was not just inevitable, but necessary. I frowned. But why kill them? What was the killer trying to achieve? Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his desk and withdrew the smallest of items, a silver coin, worn and dulled by years of touch. He placed it between the artifacts. Because this is not a series of murders, he said. It is a design, a myth being written in real time. The killer wants to create a legend of a prophet, a truth-teller who foresaw his own death and whose words echoed into the next. I sat back. So the killer isn't trying to cover up the deaths. He's trying to immortalize them. Precisely. And with each chapter, Davenport, Lavery, now Finch, the illusion becomes harder to break. But why those men? Why them specifically? Holmes tapped the pocket watch with a fingertip. Because each of them believed, not just in prophecy, but in predetermination. They were the perfect vessels. Their minds were open, not to truth, but to suggestion. He stood and crossed to the window, his voice low. The murderer is not merely a killer. He's an author, a dramatist. He wants us not to solve the story, but to follow it, to admire its cleverness. He turned back to me, and we are getting dangerously close to the final page. That evening, Holmes vanished. For 3 hours he left no note, took no coat. When he returned, his face was flushed from the cold, but his expression was one of renewed purpose. "I've confirmed something," he said, "about the clock." "About the commission," Holmes replied. "The man who ordered it never gave his name, but he did give an address." "Whose?" Holmes met my gaze. Eliza Kemp. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. Holmes stood by the fire, coat still dusted with mist from his return, his face in half-shadow as the flames flickered against the contours of his sharp features. On the table lay the latest revelation, an invoice for a custom-made clock, issued not in Davenport's name, but to an address belonging to Miss Eliza Kemp. It was sent to a private postbox under the name E. Kilburn, Holmes said. A convenient alias, close enough to her own to recall when needed, far enough to avoid immediate suspicion. The craftsman remembered her distinctly, said she insisted the piece be delivered without contact, paid in cash, no questions. I glanced at the ornate silver pocket watch Holmes had laid beside the invoice. "And she never mentioned it? Never mentioned a great many things," Holmes replied. He turned and paced the room, his steps measured, like a metronome counting out some internal rhythm. Then he paused and said, almost as an aside, "Watson, what do you make of the phrase Davenport used? The man who repeats." I thought a moment. It's cryptic, a symbol, someone caught in a loop, repeating actions, perhaps deaths, or someone creating them, Holmes murmured, again and again, with slight variation, each echo deeper than the last. He picked up a sheaf of letters, copies of Davenport's final writings. Davenport called his killer a prophet. Lavery called him a circle. Finch called him the voice behind the voice. They each named something intangible, and yet, behind it all, one mind shaped the narrative. Holmes glanced at the fire, then at me. Eliza Kemp loved Davenport once. She admitted as much, but what she never said was how that love ended, or what it did to her. We left Baker Street just before noon, and made our way through the back lanes of Marylebone. The clouds hung low, and the damp air clung to the brickwork like old secrets. Kemp's residence was a modest row house of ivy-clad stone, its windows narrow and drawn. Holmes knocked with polite firmness. Kemp answered the door herself. Her expression, as she took in Holmes and myself, shifted not to surprise, but to resignation. "You've come," she said quietly. Holmes inclined his head. "I usually do." She let us in without a word. The parlour was sparse but elegant. No photographs, no clutter. Just books, polished wood, and the faint scent of old lilacs. Holmes stood near the hearth. "Miss Kemp, I'd like to speak with you about Colin Davenport." A flicker passed through her eyes. "There's nothing more to say." "There's everything to say," Holmes said gently. "You loved him." She didn't deny it. "You followed his descent into obsession. You watched as he grew convinced of his ability to foresee events. And when the world turned away from him, publishers, friends, the Diogenes Club, you remained." Still, she said nothing. Holmes went on, "But he never returned your affection. Not as he once did. He was no longer interested in love, was he? Only legacy. Only the illusion of prophecy." At that, Kemp's eyes shimmered. "He wanted to matter," she whispered. "He said he could prove time wasn't linear. That if he could predict his own death, down to the minute, the world would have to believe him. And so you helped." "Him," Holmes said softly. "You gave him the tools, the clock, the setting. You made the illusion possible." She said nothing, her gaze fixed on the window, as if watching a storm only she could see. "But that wasn't enough," Holmes continued, "because once he died, the illusion was in danger of unravelling. What if someone doubted? What if they dismissed it as madness? You had to make the story bigger, more symmetrical." He stepped closer. "So you repeated it. Lavery, Finch, all guided to the same fate, all offered a place in the myth." At last she turned. "I didn't kill them," she said. "No," Holmes agreed. "You didn't have to. You only had to convince them they were already dead." Back at Baker Street, the fog had thickened, and the city's edge seemed to blur into a dream. Holmes sat in silence for nearly an hour, his fingers laced beneath his chin, his gaze fixed on the unlit hearth. "She weaponized belief, Watson," he said at last. "That is what makes this case unique." I nodded slowly. She convinced 3 men that death was not merely coming, but already written. She let them step into its arms willingly. That is not murder of the hand. It is murder of the mind. Holmes's eyes glinted, and the brilliance of it is this: she never had to be present. Each man walked into the moment himself. The letter, the time, the chair. They completed the performance, believing it was their idea. But why? I asked. What did she gain? Holmes turned to me. She made him immortal, Watson. And in death, Davenport became the very thing he could not be in life, a prophet. And she, his final editor. Chapter 11. The Bait. Holmes's Grand Strategy. The following morning Holmes was a man transformed, not in appearance, for he looked much as he always did. Coat neatly pressed, cravat perfectly knotted, eyes as sharp as obsidian. But there was a subtle shift in his movements, a quickness in his step, an energy like static in the air before a thunderstorm. He said little over breakfast save for an occasional hum, low and tuneless, as he glanced over a stack of newspaper clippings he had pulled from our archive. I caught glimpses of dates and names, Davenport, Lavery, Finch, and curiously old theatre reviews. At last, as I set down my coffee cup, Holmes looked up. "Today, Watson," he said, "we shall be performing." Performing, indeed, but not in any drawing-room or theatre. Our stage is smaller, intimate, the audience limited to one. He stood and retrieved a sealed envelope from his desk drawer. "This," he said, "is the final page of the script." We made our way to the British Museum shortly after 10 o'clock. The fog of the past few days replaced now with a biting wind. Holmes was brisk, his eyes dancing with a quiet anticipation I'd only seen once before, in the final hours before he unmasked the killer in the case of the two-faced widow. Inside, the museum's reading room was near empty. Only a few scattered scholars hunched over tomes, their presence unnoticed save for the occasional cough or rustle of turning pages. Holmes approached the central desk and spoke quietly to the librarian. "I've reserved space at table 11 under the name Kilburn." The man nodded, gestured toward a desk at the rear, and Holmes led me there with deliberate steps. Upon the table he placed the envelope. "What's in it?" I asked. "A message," he said, "written in the hand of Colin Davenport, or what appears to be." He didn't elaborate. At precisely 10:30, a familiar figure entered the room. Eliza Kemp. She moved like someone who had walked this path before. Quiet, efficient, and certain of her destination. Her eyes scanned the room just once, found us, and continued past without a flicker of recognition. But her pace faltered as she passed table 11. Holmes did not look at her. I, too, remained still. We heard the whisper of parchment as she lifted the envelope. Then her footsteps receded into the far corridor. Holmes smiled without turning. She took it. We remained another hour at the museum. Holmes did not move, his gaze fixed upon the shelves ahead. Only when the clock above the librarian's desk chimed noon did he finally speak. "She'll return home now," he said, rising. "She'll read it twice, then she'll burn it. But not before the damage is done. What did you write?" Holmes offered the faintest grin. "I told her the circle was closing, that the final death had already occurred, and that her part had been written, that the only question left was whether she would complete the pattern." I stared. "You're bluffing." He shook his head. "No, I'm predicting. I've simply borrowed her method." We left the museum and returned to Baker Street. Holmes remained uncharacteristically silent for much of the afternoon, watching the street through a gap in the curtains, his fingers laced beneath his chin. At 5 minutes to 4, a knock came. He turned to me. "Look, stay seated, Watson. Say nothing unless I ask it." I nodded. He opened the door. Eliza Kemp entered, gloves still on. Her breath slightly quickened. Her eyes darted between us, calculating, assessing. "You wrote it," she said. Holmes inclined his head. "I did. You have no proof. I don't need it. Then why summon me?" Holmes crossed the room and retrieved a single item from the mantel, an envelope, identical to the one from the museum. "This," he said, "is yours." He offered it to her. She didn't take it. Instead, she stepped back, her jaw tight. "You believe I led them to death, that I convinced them." "I know you did," Holmes said gently, "but what matters is why." She stared at him, and for a moment I thought she would deny everything. But then her shoulders lowered, and a strange calm overtook her face. "They believed in something," she said, "finally. Not in God or law or progress, but in meaning, in design." She looked toward the cracked pocket watch on the table. Colin wanted to be remembered. Lavery wanted to understand. Finch, he just wanted to feel chosen. Holmes spoke softly. "And what did you want?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned toward the door. "I'll expect the police within the hour," she said. Holmes gave a faint nod. She left without another word. After she had gone, Holmes moved to the hearth and dropped the second envelope into the fire. "Was there anything in it?" I asked. "No," he said. "She never opened it." I blinked. "Then why?" "Because," Holmes said, watching the paper curl and blacken, "belief is the most dangerous instrument in a murderer's toolkit. She had to believe I could see the future too, that I had stepped into her design." He turned to me. "And that, Watson, is how you catch a killer who uses time as a weapon. You make them feel as though they've already lost." Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. It was late evening when we sat again in our rooms at Baker Street, the fire burning low and the gaslights casting a quiet golden hush over Holmes's scattered files. Outside, the wind hissed softly against the glass, as if London itself held its breath. Holmes had been in a state of rare stillness since Eliza Kemp's departure hours earlier. He had neither spoken nor moved beyond the occasional flick of an ash into the tray beside him. I had grown accustomed to these silences, knowing they were not signs of indecision, but rather the deep workings of a machine about to reach its final click. And then, quite suddenly, he sat forward. "It was never about Davenport," he said. I blinked. "I beg your pardon?" He stood and began pacing, not frantically, but as though each step marked a phrase in an argument now clear only to him. "Davenport was the bait, Watson, not for us, for her. He believed in the performance. He believed in what he called the circle. But he was a man living inside a story he didn't write." He stopped at the fireplace. "And we've been doing the same." I frowned. "You mean—" "I mean," Holmes interrupted, "we assumed the circle began with Davenport, that the prophecy, the notes, the deaths, they all spiraled outward from him. But they didn't." He turned to me, eyes sharp. They spiraled. Inward. I sat forward. Inward to what? To a single fixed point, Holmes said, which has remained motionless at the centre of it all. He crossed to the table and withdrew the letters we had collected, the notes found on Davenport and Lavery, and the final scrawl from Finch's desk. He laid them side by side. All three contained the same word, he said, in phrasing or implication. Echo. I nodded. Yes. The man who repeats. The echo must end. The circle closes. Holmes lifted the final note from Lavery's room. The echo is incomplete. The circle cannot close while the last voice remains. It's a riddle, I said. No, Holmes whispered. It's a confession. He looked at me, the light from the fire dancing in his eyes. We've been misreading the term echo, Watson. We took it to mean repetition, copies of Davenport's death, a motif. But what if it wasn't poetic? What if it was literal? I frowned. Literal? Holmes moved across the room and pulled down a slim volume from his shelf. The Science of Memory and Auditory Perception, by one Dr. Emery Blankenship. He opened to a page near the back. In certain disorders, Holmes read aloud, the sufferer retains not just words spoken to them, but moments, experiences, memories they did not live, but that resound in their minds as if carried from another source. He looked up. Memory that doesn't belong to them. Memories? Echoed. I shook my head slowly. You're suggesting this was... What? Psychological transference? I'm suggesting, Holmes said slowly, that someone engineered a series of events not to repeat deaths, but to repeat impressions, to make it feel as though the same crime occurred 3 times. He placed the pocket watches before us again, both stuck at 10. Tell me, Watson, what's the simplest explanation? Hesitated that they were manipulated, made to believe that what was happening had already been foretold. Holmes nodded. Because if you believe you've already experienced something, you're more likely to accept it, to stop fighting. He turned back to the desk. And who would understand that better than someone trained in human behavior? Someone capable not only of setting a scene, but of placing ideas inside the minds of others. I stood slowly. Kemp. Holmes didn't reply. Instead, he walked to the mantel, picked up the watch she had returned, Lavery's, and held it to the light. Then he opened it. Inside, behind the cracked face, something had come loose. A scrap of paper, thinner than the others. Holmes unfolded it gently. Written on it, in delicate but unmistakable penmanship, were the words, "You are not the first to read this, and you won't be the last." Holmes exhaled slowly. She wasn't merely tying up the story, Watson, he said. She was testing it. She wanted to see if the pattern would continue without her. I stared at him. She wanted to see the echo form again. Later that evening, we received a telegram. It was from Lestrade, terse and hurried, Miss Kemp in custody. Found attempting to send parcel to unidentified recipient. Contained final manuscript. Proof chapter. Will deliver to Baker Street for review. Holmes folded the telegram and placed it beside the letter. The echo was the story itself, he said. Each man lived a version of it. Kemp merely created the conditions. The clock, the letters, the suggestion. But in the end, he trailed off. In the end, they walked into it freely. There was a long pause between us. Finally, I spoke. "You almost admire her." Holmes looked at me, startled, but only slightly. "I understand her," he said. "She built something out of nothing. Not a legacy of death, but a myth, and she nearly made it real." He turned toward the window, where the street lamps glowed like lanterns against the fog. "But belief, Watson, belief is the most dangerous crime of all. Once it takes root, even reason must knock twice before entering." Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. It was shortly past midday when Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street, shoulders hunched against the bitter wind, his expression drawn tighter than usual. "She tried to send the manuscript abroad," he said, stepping into the warmth of our sitting room. "Used a false name, false address. But the parcel was intercepted by our man at the post. Someone's been watching her, just as you asked. Holmes." Holmes nodded, offering no trace of satisfaction. He took the package from Lestrade's hands and carried it to the writing desk. It was plain brown paper, tightly bound, with a forged sender's label affixed with precision. Inside was a bound folio, handwritten, meticulously arranged. Holmes peeled back the first page. At the top, in a delicate, deliberate script, was the title, "The Circle of Memory," a final testament by Colin Davenport Watson. And I leaned closer as Holmes turned the page. The contents were extraordinary. I remember the man who came before me. I remember the shape of his death. I remember the future he wrote with blood and ink and breath. And I know now, I am not the first to remember it. I am only the latest voice in a long echo. The manuscript wove between dream and confession, madness and philosophy. But to Holmes it was more than literature. "It's her masterpiece," he said, his voice unreadable. "Written in his voice, arranged in his cadence. But it's hers." Lestrade frowned. "She wrote this?" Holmes nodded. "Or at least assembled it, pieced together his scattered thoughts, and turned them into a mythology." "And she tried to publish it?" "No," Holmes said. "She tried to disappear it, into legend, abroad, under a pseudonym, untraceable, the final piece of her design. She knew we were closing in, which is why," Holmes said, closing the manuscript, "she had to escape, not from a prison, but from blame. If this had made it to press, history would remember Davenport as a visionary, Lavery and Finch as his disciples. Kemp would be forgotten, an anonymous architect in the wings, and we would forever be chasing shadows." Lestrade folded his arms. "Well, she'll be answering for it now. We've got her at Bow Street, quiet as a mouse since she came in." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "She won't stay quiet. We arrived at Bow Street Station just after 2:00. The holding cell was cold and narrow, lit only by a high-barred window. Miss Eliza Kemp sat at the far end, her posture upright, her hands folded in her lap. She turned her head at the sound of our approach, her expression unreadable. Holmes stepped forward, Lestrade and I just behind him. "You've read it, then?" she said quietly. Holmes did not answer at once. He simply nodded and placed the manuscript gently on the bench just outside the cell. "You chose the language of prophecy," he said, "not to confuse us, but to protect yourself. If it's a myth, no one seeks a motive. If it's inevitable, no one asks who pulled the strings." She smiled faintly. "It was never about me." "No," Holmes agreed. That's what made it so clever. Kemp looked toward the barred window. Do you know what he said to me, Holmes? Colin, just before he sat down in that chair. Holmes waited. He said, I've already seen this moment. It ends with silence. So let's not waste time with fear. She turned back to Holmes, and he meant it. Because you made him believe it. No, she said, because he wanted to believe it. All I did was give him a mirror. Holmes stepped closer. But you positioned the mirror. You set the scene, drew the circle, gave him the final page. He tapped the manuscript behind. Him! This wasn't a suicide. It was a performance, with you as playwright and audience. Her voice dropped to a whisper. What if that's the only immortality there is? Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then, and what if someone reads it, believes it again? What happens when another echo begins? At that, her composure faltered. For the first time, her hands trembled in her lap. Holmes pressed on. You weren't trying to escape justice. You were trying to escape irrelevance. But it's over now. The echo stops here. She looked down. I wonder, she said, if that's what Colin wanted. Holmes did not reply. He turned and walked away. Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying with it the promise of another London night, sooty, cold and timeless. Lestrade fell in beside us as we stepped into the street. You'll testify, I suppose, he said. If necessary, Holmes replied. She'll stand trial for it. Not murder, at least not in the traditional sense. But enough to see justice done. Justice, Holmes repeated softly. Yes. Back at Baker Street, I poured us, each a brandy. Holmes took his without comment, sinking into the chair by the fire. He stared into the flames for several minutes. She made them believe, I said at last. She didn't need poison or a weapon, just an idea. Holmes nodded. An idea shaped like truth. That's always the most dangerous. And what? Now? Holmes raised his glass. Now we wait. For what? He smiled faintly, to see if the echo truly ends here. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed. The days that followed were curiously still. Eliza Kemp remained in custody, her silence uninterrupted save for one formal statement, that she had simply provided the means for those with knowledge of their end to arrive at it with dignity. She claimed to have taken no life, to have poisoned no drink, to have left no fingerprints on any of the clocks or notes. She spoke in effect like the narrator of a myth, one who told the tale but did not live within it. But for Holmes the case was not yet closed. For 3 days he barely left our rooms, surrounded by constables' notes, letters, receipts, sketches of clock mechanisms, and Davenport's final manuscript. He rarely spoke, save to issue short requests, ink, scissors, one particular volume from the British Library's lending shelf. Then, on the evening of the 3rd day, as the church bells tolled 6, Holmes looked up from the hearth and said, "Watson, do you recall the ink on Lavery's final letter?" I frowned. It was smudged, was it not? As though he had written it in haste. "Yes," Holmes replied, "but that's the inconsistency." He crossed the room and laid out the 3 letters we had preserved from the victims. Davenport's poetic final page, Lavery's clipped warning, and Finch's scattered lines from his journal. They were written with the same brand of ink, same flow, same viscosity, a precise black with a subtle iron smell, an artisan blend sold only at a single stationer in Mayfair. And yet, he held up a handkerchief. Lavery's ink left residue on his sleeve. Davenport's did not. Finch's faded unevenly. Each one degraded differently, despite being written within days of one another. "What are you suggesting?" Holmes turned to the fireplace and gestured toward the grate. "Kemp did not merely influence their minds, Watson. She tampered with the evidence. She copied and rewrote their words. She wanted consistency, one echo, resounding clearly. But no two men write identically under duress. She forgot that." I stepped forward. "You believe she composed the letters herself?" "I believe," Holmes said, "that Kemp copied their intent, not their words. Lavery's letter is too precise. Finch's journal contains references to events he could not have known, and Davenport's final page, hidden beneath the clock, delivered perfectly in his cadence, is too structured to be spontaneous." He turned, his voice sharpening. "She wrote the chorus, Watson. The men merely sang it." That night, Holmes requested an audience with Miss Kemp, not at the station, but at a quiet annex at Scotland Yard, where she was escorted under guard. The room was bare, just a table, a pair of chairs, and 2 glasses of water. She sat calmly across from us, her hands folded once more. Holmes placed before her a small envelope. Inside it were 3 sheets, photostats of the final letters. "These," he said, "have been matched in pressure, rhythm, and fluid density. Their spacing is identical. Not similar, identical." Kemp did not speak. Holmes continued, "No two people write in the same breath, with the same pause between phrases. But you, Miss Kemp, you did not write them as people. You wrote them as a playwright scripts dialogue, cleanly, deliberately, for a narrative arc." Still she remained silent. Holmes leaned forward. "Do you know how I know you slipped?" She glanced at him now, her gaze measured. "In Finch's letter," Holmes said softly, "he referenced the pendulum motion of Davenport's final minutes. And yet, Finch never saw Davenport's body, never saw the clock, never saw the chair." Holmes tapped the page. "He knew because you told him. You described it to him in poetic detail. You made him believe it was real, because for you it had already been rehearsed. For a moment there was no sound but the ticking of the yard's clock behind us. Then Eliza Kemp smiled. A slow, sad smile. "Do you know what it's like," she said, "to be the one person who sees the pattern, and knows she will never be credited for it?" Holmes regarded her steadily. "I do not seek to deny your brilliance. No," she said, "you seek to cage it." She stood calmly, though the guards behind her tensed. "But you're wrong, Mr. Holmes," she said. "This won't end with me. The echo is louder now, and someone will hear it." Holmes rose as well. "And someone," he said, "will recognize the voice." Later that night, back in Baker Street, Holmes poured a measure of brandy and settled into his chair with the slow, deliberate grace of a man coming to rest after a long pursuit. "Well?" I asked. "She will be charged," he said quietly. "Forgery, fraud, incitement, possibly accessory to suicide, though the law may not stretch far enough to name what she did." "And the myth?" Holmes smiled faintly. It ends where all myths do, in the mouth of the last person willing to believe it. He lifted his glass. She wrote her legend in ink and illusion, but she made the mistake of writing it in our world. And here, Watson, stories don't dictate truth. Evidence does. He looked toward the window, where the London fog had crept back in to shroud the lamps in silence. She used belief to kill, he said, and I used belief to catch her. And with that, Holmes lifted his glass in a quiet toast, not to victory, but to the end of the circle. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. It was a cold morning in early February, when Holmes sent out the final set of invitations. Brief, unsigned cards, written in his spidery hand, delivered by hand through discreet channels. Each bore only a single line. You were part of the circle. Come, and it shall be closed. The location was not Baker Street, nor Scotland Yard, but the private room of an old and disused lecture hall tucked behind King's College. Once used for scientific demonstrations, it now sat largely forgotten, its tall windows opaque with age, its benches creaking under the weight of silence. At precisely noon, the first guest arrived. Lionel Marsh, tall and well-coiffed as ever, though his usual sparkle had dulled. He carried a cane he did not require, and a scarf that seemed more for hiding his throat than for warmth. He nodded curtly to me as he entered, but said nothing to Holmes. Next came Inspector Lestrade, his brows drawn low in cautious wariness. He had come reluctantly, believing the matter concluded, but Holmes had asked for his presence in the interest of completeness, and Lestrade, for all his bluster, trusted Holmes more than he'd ever admit. Finally, she arrived. Eliza Kemp, escorted by a plainclothes officer. Dressed in grey, her figure slim and upright, she carried herself not as a prisoner, but as a mourner. There was no trace of defiance now, only that curious stillness of someone resigned to the closing of the door. Holmes stood at the centre of the room. There was no stage, no grand oratory space, just a circle of 5 chairs, evenly spaced. He gestured for all to sit. "Thank you," he said with surprising formality. "Each of you has played a role, some unwittingly, some consciously, in the creation of a myth." He turned first to Marsh. "You produced Davenport's early works. You encouraged his theatrics, even after he grew unstable. You saw his madness not as tragedy, but as opportunity." Marsh shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "You accepted the timeline you were given. The scene was perfect, the letters authentic, the motive poetic. It was the sort of case the Yard could tidy up with a bow." Lestrade grimaced. "I trusted your judgment, Holmes." Holmes inclined his head. "And I thank you for it." Then he turned to Kemp. "And you, Miss Kemp, wrote the bow." She did not look away. "You gave each man his final words. You staged their deaths like echoes of one another. You controlled the clock, the ink, the rhythm, but more than that, you made them believe." She folded her hands. "I gave them peace," she said softly. "A reason. Isn't that what all of you were searching for?" Holmes didn't respond to the question. Instead, he moved to the centre of the group and reached into his coat. From it, he withdrew a slim sheaf of papers, an early draft of Davenport's Circle of Memory, unearthed from an envelope never mailed. "I had it authenticated," he said. This version was dated nearly 2 years before his death. The structure is the same, the metaphor of time as a circle. But there is one crucial absence. He turned the page toward us. No mention of the man who repeats. Lestrade blinked. But that was the whole point of it. Exactly, Holmes said, because the man who repeats, the mythic adversary, was invented after the fact. It was Kemp's invention. Her answer to the echo, a shadow to chase when the narrative grew thin. He laid the papers down. She rewrote the myth to give it weight. Kemp said nothing. Holmes turned back to the room. Each of these deaths had meaning only because we gave them meaning. We looked for patterns, we accepted symmetry. But there was no prophecy, only suggestion. He looked at each of us, and yet the effect was real. Davenport believed it. Lavery believed it. Finch believed it. That is what makes this case so dangerous. Lestrade frowned. Dangerous? Yes, Holmes said, because it succeeded. He paced slowly. This was not a string of murders, nor a suicide pact, nor a performance. It was a belief system, constructed so carefully that it made intelligent men walk to their deaths, with conviction. He stopped and looked at Kemp. You built a religion from grief. She raised her head at last. They had nothing, Mr. Holmes. They were men abandoned by time. I gave them purpose. You call it manipulation. I call it mercy. Holmes considered that in silence. Then he nodded once, and I call it murder. We left the lecture hall in silence. Lestrade made the necessary arrangements. Kemp was returned to her cell, where the final charges were prepared. Holmes made no protest, no further argument. His work, by all accounts, was finished, but I knew better. As we rode the cab back to Baker Street, I watched Holmes carefully. His gaze was turned not outward to the grey streets of London, but inward, still tracing the circle in his mind. "Do you believe her?" I asked at last. Holmes looked at me. "I believe she believed," he said. "That's what made her so dangerous." He reached into his coat and withdrew a final note, one I had not seen. It was a single sentence, written in familiar, flowing script. He who remembers the future need not fear the present. He stared at it. Another of Davenport's? Holmes folded it carefully and returned it to his pocket. "No," he said. "This one was found in her own handwriting, on her desk, dated a year before Davenport's death." A chill passed through me. She planned it all that far in advance? Longer, perhaps, Holmes said, but time, for her, was never linear. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. It was late that evening, the sky ink-black beyond the windows of Baker Street, the city quiet under a blanket of soft drizzle. A single lamp illuminated Holmes's desk, where he stood surrounded by the pieces of the case. The forged letters, the cracked pocket watches, the manuscript drafts and the sketch of Davenport's study, now marked with his usual sharp pencil. Notations. Lestrade, summoned one final time, sat in the chair opposite me with an uncharacteristic silence. The gravity of the case had settled even on his often guarded features. Holmes began, not with flourish, but with clarity. "The structure of the case," he said, "relies on 3 acts, like a stage play, each one crafted with escalating precision. Held up the first letter. The one found on Colin Davenport. They do not see the circle I walk. The man who repeats is already here. Davenport's death, Holmes said, was staged to appear prophetic, a final act of philosophical resignation. But the performance required an architect, someone to ensure that the room was prepared, the timing correct, the details flawless, that someone was Eliza Kemp. He laid the letter aside. Davenport believed himself a visionary, but his manuscript, though eccentric, was incomplete. It was Kemp who refined it. She provided the metaphor of the circle. She inserted the man who repeats. She rewrote his ideas into a structure that invited interpretation and awe. Lestrade scratched his chin. But why go to such lengths? Because myth outlives memory, Holmes replied. She didn't want him forgotten. She wanted him immortal. And she understood that to elevate a man, you must surround him with echoes. He lifted the second note, the one found on George Lavery. This is not a death. It is an echo. The man you seek will kill again, because he has already done so. Lavery, Holmes continued, was a student of Davenport's theories, obsessed with time, recursion, and determinism. Kemp approached him under the guise of shared belief. She fed him selective pieces of Davenport's final message. She convinced him that he too was part of the circle, that he would fulfill a foretold role. He glanced at me. And so, when the time came, Lavery followed the script, the position of the chair, the note, the silence. It was Davenport's death all over again, reflected, reframed. He laid the letter beside the first. Only this time, Kemp did not merely suggest a legacy. She began creating one. Lestrade frowned. And the third? Holmes picked up the final piece, the torn journal entry from Oliver Finch. He said the end was a kindness. I almost believed him. Finch was the last test, Holmes said. Less intellectually convinced than Lavery, more emotionally vulnerable. But that made him ideal. Kemp told him he would be the last voice, that by repeating the pattern he would complete the prophecy and free the others. He tapped the page, and so he vanished, his mind moulded not by coercion, but by suggestion, by repetition. Lestrade exhaled slowly. So none of them were forced. Precisely, Holmes said. That is the genius and the horror of it. No poison, no blade, only an idea, crafted and repeated until it became truth. He stepped away from the desk and crossed to the fireplace, folding his arms. Kemp forged the letters, staged the scenes, timed the clocks. She even backdated correspondence and manuscripts, depositing them in locations the victims would find, all to simulate inevitability. And she fooled them all, I said quietly. She fooled everyone, Holmes said, until the letters started to echo too perfectly, until the details became too consistent, too literary. He gestured to the clock. She made one mistake. She thought consistency was realism. But true human tragedy is uneven, flawed. Each of these echoes rang more clearly than the last. That's what made me suspicious. Lestrade rubbed his face with both hands. I've never seen anything like it. It's new. Holmes finished. This was not a crime of greed or vengeance. This was narrative homicide. Murder through myth. He turned back to the desk and gathered the 3 letters into a neat pile. But the core motive was very old. Immortality. She wanted Davenport's words to matter. And when he couldn't bring the world to listen, she made the world listen, posthumously. Lestrade stood, still pale. "She'll hang, you know." "No," Holmes said. "I suspect not. Technically, she killed no one, and the law has not yet caught up to the idea of psychological orchestration. Perhaps a sentence of confinement. Perhaps not even that." He returned to the hearth and poured himself a small measure of brandy. But what matters is that her story is over. After Lestrade had gone, I remained with Holmes by the fire. Outside, the lamplight scattered across the slick cobbles, casting hazy halos in the mist. Holmes stared into the flames, silent. "You said once that myth can be more dangerous than fact," I said. "Do you still believe that?" He nodded slowly. "Because myths do not require proof, only repetition. And yet you broke this one." He gave me a wan smile. "No," I interrupted it. "Whether it returns depends not on her, but on us." He held up the letters one last time, and whether we choose to forget the echo. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The press caught wind of the arrest 2 days later. It began with a single column in the Westminster Gazette, a brief note of a woman detained in connection with a string of unusual suicides. By the time the Times printed their version, the narrative had shifted dramatically. A criminal mastermind, a manipulator of men, a dark prophetess behind a sequence of chilling deaths that defied easy explanation. No mention was made of myths, circles or clocks, certainly no mention of Eliza Kemp's manuscript, which Scotland Yard quietly sealed and placed under restricted review. To the public, the case became little more than a curiosity, strange, tragic, and ultimately resolved. Holmes, the conclusion was more ambiguous. "There are cases," he said one morning, as we walked along the embankment beneath a rare winter sun, "where justice is merely an agreement, an arrangement society makes to accept a simplified version of a truth too complex to prosecute." I looked at him. "Do you believe this was one of them?" He nodded. "Kemp will never stand trial for murder. Her defence is airtight. No coercion, no direct action. The men chose their ends." "But they chose based on false belief," I replied. "Which is not yet a crime," Holmes said, "though it may become one in time." He stopped and stared across the Thames, the grey water rippling beneath the bridge. "Belief is the final frontier of influence, Watson, and she crossed it. Eliza Kemp was formally charged with criminal fraud, possession of forged documents, and interference with a death investigation. The Crown, wary of sensationalism, elected not to pursue additional charges. The trial, if it could be called that, was brief and clinical. Experts testified to the authenticity of her forgeries, the timeline of the forged letters, and her orchestration of the clock delivery and manuscript dissemination. Kemp herself spoke little. When asked if she had anything to say in her defence, she replied, "I created beauty where there was silence. You may call that crime. I called it love." She was sentenced to 6 years of confinement in a women's correctional institute near Brighton, though whispers suggested her mind was being watched as closely as her person. Scotland Yard, for its part, issued a statement declaring the case a victory of modern investigative coordination. Lestrade's name was mentioned no fewer than 4 times in the broadsheet coverage. Holmes's name, of course, appeared not at all. Back at Baker Street, the aftermath was, as always, quieter than the storm itself. Holmes spent several days in one of his brooding silences, playing the violin for hours without pause. The air in our sitting-room felt suspended, as if some invisible strand remained uncut. On the third evening after the sentencing, he spoke. "You remember the letter Kemp left behind?" I nodded. "The one that read, 'He who remembers the future need not fear the present.'" Holmes rose and walked to his desk, where the note still rested beneath a glass paperweight. "I believe that letter wasn't meant for the men she manipulated," he said. "It was meant for herself." He turned to me, expression unreadable. She knew the story would end, that I would break it. But the letter, that was her last echo. A way to ensure that even we questioned whether she had, in some strange way, foreseen it. I shivered despite the warmth of the fire. "You think she truly believed in what she created?" Holmes paused for a long moment. "I think she stopped knowing where the fiction ended." I published my account of the case weeks later, not in the popular journals, but in a limited volume of monographs circulated among professionals and select readers of the medical and legal sciences. I titled it, "A Study in Echoes, the Circle Construct and the Mind Behind It." It received little attention, but Holmes read every word. "You were merciful," he said, setting the final page down. "You spared her the full weight of her cunning." "She spared herself that," I replied. "I merely translated the facts." Holmes nodded then, after a long pause, said, "And what if she was right?" I looked up. "What if, years from now, someone reads Davenport's manuscript? Someone without context, without caution? What if they believe it again? The circle, the repetition, the meaning." I was quiet. "Then the myth lives," I said. Holmes nodded, "And we must trust that reason lives longer." On a cold March evening, a package arrived at Baker Street. No return address, just a neat parcel wrapped in linen twine. Inside, a single pocket watch, cracked, frozen at 10. Holmes stared at it for a long time. He did not speak. He did not move. Then, slowly, he placed it on the mantel beside the others. "Let it rest here," he said, "like a bell that no longer rings." And we sat once more in silence, waiting for the next story to begin. Chapter 18. Holmes's Final Reflection. A week passed. London, ever indifferent to the dramas that played out in its shadowed corners, resumed its familiar rhythm. The clatter of carriages returned to its regular syncopation. The street cries regained their cheerless enthusiasm, and Baker Street once again became a sanctuary of silence and smoke. Holmes, however, remained changed. He did not say so, of course. He played the violin as before, consulted on 2 minor cases with the Yard, and even attended a performance at the Lyceum. But there was a hush behind his movements, a stillness in his eyes that was not there before. It was as though the echo we had chased for weeks still resounded faintly in his mind. One evening, as the rain drummed a steady rhythm against the windows, and the fire cast slow turning shadows across the walls, I found Holmes seated at the table, gazing down at the pocket watch Kemp had sent. He had not moved it since it arrived. He joined him. "She knew where to send it," I said quietly. Yes, Holmes replied, because she knew I would understand what it meant. It's not a threat. No, he said. It's a closing gesture, her final echo. He turned to me, his voice lower now. You see, Watson, she understood something most murderers do not, that permanence is not achieved through violence, but through meaning. That's why this case was unlike any we've solved. I nodded slowly. She wanted us to see the pattern. She wanted us to believe we had always been part of it. He stood then slowly and moved to the mantel, where he reached up and carefully took the cracked watch in hand. He turned it over once, then again, before speaking. She called it a circle, he said, but it was not. Circles imply harmony, symmetry. This was a spiral, ever tightening, ever deepening. She was the centre. He returned the watch to the mantel beside the others. Colin Davenport believed he could remember the future, Holmes said. But Eliza Kemp, she created a future others would remember. He turned toward me. And that is far more dangerous. We sat in silence after that, each lost in our own thoughts. Holmes, no doubt, was deconstructing the remnants of the case, while I tried to anchor it in a narrative that could be told and understood without slipping into myth. Eventually, I asked, "Do you think it will happen again?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Then, with the faintest trace of something unreadable in his tone, he said, "There are always those who listen for echoes." He moved to his chair, settled in with an economy of motion I knew well, and steepled, his fingers beneath his chin. I've always maintained that crime, at its core, is the failure of logic, he said, but this case has forced me to consider an alternative. He looked into the fire. Perhaps some crimes are not failures of logic at all, but triumphs of belief. The following morning, I woke to find Holmes gone. On the desk, however, was a note addressed to me. My dear Watson, the day promises clarity, and so I have gone walking. I find there is something in the rhythm of steps that aligns the mind when words cannot. You need not worry. There is no new case, only the echo of an old one that must be walked out like a cramp. In the matter of Kemp, I am content that the law has done what it can. As for the rest, history is a poor witness, but a persistent one. I trust your pen more than any gavel. Burn the watches if you wish, or keep them. In either case, know this: the future has not yet been written, not truly, and those who claim to have seen it are often merely hoping you'll write it for them. Yours, as always, Sherlock Holmes. I folded the letter and placed it with the others. I did not burn the watches. Some time later, I found myself in the quiet town of Woodbridge, visiting an antiquarian bookseller with an eye for rare bindings. On a dusty shelf of forgotten pamphlets, I came across a small unmarked volume. The paper was thin, the ink familiar, the title, page read, Echoes of the Future, a voice remembered. There was no author's name, just a dedication, for the man who breaks the circle,